Alright, it is the Jewish calendar year of 5780, 5780, which means, according to the Jewish rabbis who gave us that time frame, 5,780 years ago was when Adam was placed on earth. And that's Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 4. Let me get there real quick. For the Egyptians, time preceded that date, which is 3,000 plus, almost 4,000 BC. The Palermo stone, for example, records, pretty sure it's the Palermo stone, records a king's list of kings prior to the 4,000 BCE time period. And in fact, the archaeological evidence of the Giza pyramids shows a submersion underwater, under oceanic waters specifically, as oceanic life, fossil life, are still present on the stones, as well as in the archaeological digs of the Sahara. Even a whale skeleton back in those days. The dating of the most recent flooding of the earth was 10,500 BCE, which means the Giza pyramids had been built prior to that flood. And so when we look at the Torah stories about the flood of Noah, we realize that because of so many millennia that have passed from, to the post-captivity redactor, we have to take that into consideration and not take the Torah text as literal history and accurate time frame conditions. And that must be factored in with the geological record of archaeology. In chapter 2, verse 4, we have human generations referred to. These are the human generations of the heavens and the earth. It's referring to an anthropomorphizing of heaven and earth. This comes from the Egyptian record, where heaven refers to the Egyptian goddess Nut, and the earth refers to the Egyptian god Geb. And in Genesis chapter 1, as I've gone over, was their story told in a non-anthropomorphic accounting narrative. And yet we realize that the redactor is turning the Egyptian documents into a narrative that is understandable for him, rather than the original intention of the Egyptian source documents. And so we, instead of listing a number of generations, it starts off in verse 5 going over what appears to be a second beautification of the earth, as chapter 1 already talked about vegetation being planted and growing and animal life then coming, which is similar to the Nile inundation. And here we have a different context, as the redactor is trying to tell a narrative harmonizing the Egyptian documents into one narrative. And so this gardening of Eden, or paradise as it's referred to, is to help establish in the mind of the narrator, the redactor, a cohesive storyline. And so it's not until we get to, well, we have the Euphrates River being one of the rivers here. So he's purposely trying to place the ancient location of the Garden of Eden in the Middle Eastern area, whereas different cultures place their Eden within their area. The Mesopotamians, for example, placed it around Nineveh, and India places their utopia or nirvana, or whatever they call it, in their area, their land. The Egyptians, Heliopolis was their Garden of Eden, and then the American natives, the ancient native Indians, the Mayan and the Aztec, placed it in North and South America. And so finally we get to the man in verse 15. He says he took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. And so lots of people refer to God as being a tyrant, just wanting a slave to take care of the garden, which is not quite what's going on when you realize that God does not live on the earth. He places man on it to beautify the earth, domesticate it, and not dominate as a tyrant. Okay. Alright, and so here we have, instead of out of the waters, the creation of life, we have out of the ground in verse 19. He formed the beasts of the field. And this goes to Khnum, who forms mankind, and Ptah also is a sculptor of life, similar to a clay maker. That was the best way they could describe it. And so the original idols of ancient days were based on this concept that our bodies are tabernacles of the soil. Thus Adam is defined as soil, as soil in translation is given the feminine singular ending. And so you have Adam being referred to in here, being formed of the ground. And let's see, you got to go back to, that's the creation of the woman. Yeah, I skipped ahead. In verse 6, before we get to the rivers, we get the genealogy. There went up a mist from the earth. The father and mother of Geb and Nut were Shu and Tephnut. Shu is the heir, who we've already been introduced to in Genesis chapter 1 as the Rakia, or firmament, the heir between the sky and the land. And the mist referred to here in verse 6 is Tefnut. She's mist, moisture. And so what you have is the man, who is later called Adam, because he's formed of the soil, and he is made similar to clay pottery is formed. You take the soil and you add in moisture, and you're able to form the clay into what you're wanting to form. And that's how they're describing the creation of the man, who is called Adam. And this is the Egyptian creation concept of Khnum forming on a potter's wheel, as well as Ta. And then you have in verse 7, and the Yahweh Elohim formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. There's Shu, the air. And that then is the God being referred to as Yahweh. I didn't go over a more advanced lesson for you with who God is identified with in chapter 1. I'm going to hold off on that. You're going to have to go to my Paleo-Hebrew lessons for that understanding. But there's a purpose for identifying the name of God as Yah in chapter 1, and then all of a sudden in chapter 2, verse 4, Yah, the son Yah, transforms into Yahweh, or Yahweh, or whichever way you choose to pronounce it. Okay, and that's the formation, that's the genealogy that's referred to in verse 4. Because I always wondered, well, where's the genealogy? We don't get to the genealogy until we get to the descendants of Adam with Noah. And that's why, is because we have the genealogy of Adam's parents, Geb's parents, and how he was formed, similar to the woman. So, yeah, the next is the garden scene. So we'll talk about that next. But in verse 25, they both were naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. This also comes from the Egyptian Nut and Geb, who, as you can see for yourself from the Egyptian glyphs, they were naked in those glyphs as well. And so he's looking at those glyphs, the redactor is looking at these glyphs to tell the story in his words, in his understanding. And that's where he's getting it from. The Egyptian story about Nut and Geb is about how they fell in love with each other and needed to be separated by Shu under the orders of Adam, which, interesting as a phonetic comparison, but different in the sense that Adam in Hebrew is soil and refers to Geb. But the not being ashamed part is part of the Egyptian story, that they fell in love with each other. Geb got Nut pregnant. Shu separated them before she got pregnant, or after she got pregnant. And because of that, the calendar is discussed with the story, turning it from a 360-day calendar for the religious calendar of Egypt into a civil calendar with the addition of 5 more days to make it 365 days for the civil calendar, similar to our calendar. And that's what the redactor is getting to here. We also get with Enoch, who is carried up into heaven, and 365 is referred to as his age, which, yes, corresponds with the calendar of the Egyptian with the story of Geb and Nut. And their children are going to be the next story, starting with Cain and Abel, and we'll get to that soon here.